The old house creaked under the weight of its secrets. The walls, once a soft shade of cream, were now stained with years of neglect, their chipped surfaces bearing the marks of time and sorrow. Amelia sat on the edge of her bed, her small body curled up in the corner, trying to disappear into the shadows. Her eyes were fixed on the floor, but she could hear the low murmur of her father's voice coming from downstairs, gruff and angry, as always. "Amelia!" His shout echoed through the house, making her flinch. "I said get down here now." She didn't move. The tension that had built over the last few weeks, months, really had become a constant hum in the air. Amelia could feel it vibrating through the floorboards, through the walls. There was no safe place anymore. Not even in her own room. Her stomach ached, not just from hunger, but from the growing weight of the silence. The silence that had enveloped her after her mother, Maria, died. The silence that had become a weapon in her father's hands, used to control and manipulate, to twist everything into something that didn't make sense. She had been trying to ignore the gnawing pain in her stomach, the emptiness of her days, the weight of the fear pressing against her ribs. But tonight, something felt different. The air was heavier, more suffocating. Maybe it was the quiet before the storm. Amelia glanced over at the old rotary phone on the nightstand. She had never used it much, too scared of getting into trouble. But tonight, it felt like the only thing that could save her, if she could just call someone. Her fingers trembled as she reached for the receiver. The cold plastic sent a shiver up her spine. She had heard about 911, the emergency number, on TV once. They said you could call it if you needed help, if you were in trouble. But would they believe her? Would anyone believe that it wasn't just some tantrum, some lie from a lonely, troubled child? Her heart thudded in her chest as she dialed the number, the clumsy, unfamiliar motion of her fingers making her palms sweat. As the line rang, she squeezed her eyes shut, hoping the officer who answered would be kind, would listen. 911, what's your emergency? The voice was calm, too calm, but Amelia felt a flicker of something. Relief, just from hearing it. I need help," Amelia whispered. Her voice was barely audible, trembling like a leaf caught in the wind. "It's my daddy. He hurts me." She paused, terrified to say more, terrified that the words would be too much. But they were already out, raw and exposed. There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and Amelia's heart pounded faster with each second that passed. Was anyone even listening? The dispatcher spoke again, this time with more urgency. "Sweetheart, can you tell me your name? Where are you?" Amelia's throat felt tight, like she was choking. She could hear her father's footsteps on the stairs now, growing louder, closer. She could feel the darkness closing in on her. "I'm Amelia. I'm in my room. Amelia, stay on the line with me. Help is on the way. Can you tell me what's going on?" Her mind raced. How could she explain the endless nights of screaming, of silence, of hurt? The bruises, the fear, the loneliness. She couldn't even find the words. But then her father's voice sliced through the air again, sharp as a knife. "Amelia." His voice was low now, dangerous. "Who are you talking to?" The blood drained from her face. The phone was still pressed to her ear, but she froze, unable to make a sound. Her father's heavy footsteps came closer, slow, deliberate steps that told her he was coming for her. "Who are you talking to?" Michael's voice rang out, this time closer, his fury palpable. Amelia's breath caught in her throat. Her hand, still clutching the phone, trembled. She felt the pressure of the world closing in on her. I have to go," Amelia whispered into the receiver. The dispatcher on the other end hadn't said a word, but Amelia could sense something in the silence. The woman was still there, waiting. But Amelia couldn't hold on any longer. Before she could hang up, the phone was ripped from her hand. Michael stood in the doorway, his face twisted with fury. His tall frame blocked out the dim light from the hallway, casting him in a shadow that seemed too big, too dark. His eyes were wide, filled with a mixture of rage and something else, something cold. "You think you can call people, huh? You think you can get away from me?" His voice was like gravel, each word a stone thrown with deliberate force. He took a step forward, and Amelia took a step back, but there was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. She had only ever seen him this angry a few times before, and each time, it had felt like the world might crack open. He was like a storm, fierce, unpredictable, and all-consuming. "You're not going anywhere, little girl," Michael growled. "You hear me?" Amelia's legs were shaking now, her small body trembling with fear. She wanted to scream, to shout for help, but all that came out was a tiny, pitiful gasp. Michael's eyes darted down to the phone in his hand, and he snarled, "I ought to teach you a lesson for that. No one's going to believe you. No one." For a moment, all she could hear was her own breath, shallow and quick, the panic rising in her chest. She wanted to disappear. She wanted to be anywhere but here, with him, in this house that felt like a prison. But even in her fear, Amelia couldn't help but notice something. The silence that had hung in the air after Michael's shout. The way it lingered, thick and oppressive. He was waiting for her to say something, to show fear, to break. But Amelia didn't break. Not this time. She stood there, trembling but silent, and as her father's rage raged around her, she held on to the one thing she hadn't been able to hold on to for so long, her own voice. The phone slipped from Michael's hand, falling with a dull thud to the floor. For a moment, everything was still. Amelia stood there, her heart hammering in her chest, but she didn't look away. She was no longer the little girl who cowered in the corner, waiting for the storm to pass. This time, she had reached out, and somehow it had made all the difference. Even if nothing happened tonight, if Michael's lies went unnoticed, if the police never came, she had done it. She had called out. She had screamed in silence, and she was still standing. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough to keep her going. The morning light crept through the dusty curtains, painting the room in soft, golden hues that contrasted with the dark weight in Amelia's chest. She had barely slept. The echoes of her father's rage still lingered in her ears. The fear still gripped her heart. She hadn't dared look at the phone again since the call, the one that, in her heart, felt like a desperate cry that had been swallowed by the silence. Amelia lay in her bed, staring at the cracks in the ceiling, the air in the room heavy with the unspoken. Michael had stormed out of her room after he'd taken the phone, muttering under his breath, but not before warning her in that cold, low voice of his, "If you try that again, Amelia, I'll make sure they never listen to you. You're mine. Understand?" She had nodded, silent, afraid that anything else would set him off. She didn't understand how or why he was like this. He hadn't always been. There had been a time years ago, before Maria died, when Michael was just a man who went to work, came home, and had dinner with his family. But something had changed. Something twisted, something dark had been buried inside him, growing day by day, until it consumed everything. And now, in this suffocating house, she couldn't even remember the last time she'd felt safe. The sound of the doorbell broke through the stillness, followed by the muffled sound of Michael's voice answering it. Amelia flinched at the familiar steps that followed, the footsteps of the men in uniform. The police had come. She pulled herself from the bed, heart hammering in her chest. She wanted to run, to hide somewhere where no one could find her, but she knew there was nowhere to go. Michael was already at the front door, talking to the officers with his smooth, calculated tone, the one that made everything sound plausible, even when it was a lie. Amelia's legs moved of their own accord as she crept toward the stairs, careful not to make a sound. From the top of the stairs, she could see the two officers standing by the door, their faces neutral but their eyes scanning the room, taking in the details of the modest living room. The worn furniture, the faded pictures on the walls, the smell of stale air. Michael was already playing his part, smiling, shaking their hands. "Thank you for coming," Michael said, his voice dripping with charm. "I didn't know what to do. My daughter's been acting out ever since Maria. Well, you know. He trailed off, his eyes flickering to the stairs as though expecting her to appear. She's been having trouble with her emotions ever since my wife passed away. I'm doing the best I can to raise her right. But, you know, kids sometimes don't understand. One officer, a tall man with a square jaw, glanced at Amelia at the top of the stairs, and she froze. She wanted to speak, to tell them everything, to shout the truth, but her mouth was dry, her voice locked in place. She couldn't move. Well, we'll need to have a quick word with Amelia, just to make sure everything's okay, the officer said gently, but his words weren't a question. They were a formality. Michael's smile never wavered, but something cold flickered behind his eyes. Of course. Amelia, sweetheart, come on down here. These fine officers just want to talk to you. Amelia hesitated, her heart pounding louder in her chest. She stepped down slowly, each creak of the stairs sounding like a thunderclap in her ears. Amelia, sweetheart, these officers just want to ask you a few questions. Can you tell them what's been going on? Michael's voice was steady now. His tone softened as he addressed her like she was a child who didn't understand the situation. The officers turned their gaze to her, waiting, their faces unreadable but patient. Amelia's mind raced. She knew they were supposed to help her, but she also knew what would happen if she told the truth. She could already hear Michael's voice in her head, his threats echoing in her mind. You're mine. No one will believe you. No one will care. Amelia. One of the officers prompted gently, stepping closer to her. Amelia opened her mouth, but the words tangled in her throat. She wanted to scream, to tell them everything. The bruises, the nights locked in her room, the constant fear, but she couldn't. She had been too scared for too long to say anything that might get her into even more trouble. She had learned, in the pit of her stomach, that when Michael's anger flared, no one would stop it. Her voice came out small and shaky, barely above a whisper. I'm fine. Michael was already moving to her side, resting a hand on her shoulder, a show of concern that felt like a vice tightening around her. He squeezed just a little too hard. Amelia winced, but she didn't pull away. She knew better. She's just been upset, he continued, his voice taking on a soft, fatherly tone. Ever since Maria passed away, she's been struggling to cope. I'm doing my best, but I think she's just lashing out. It's nothing serious. The officers exchanged a glance, then turned back to her. Amelia, are you sure everything's okay? The other officer, a woman with blonde hair pulled back into a tight ponytail, asked gently, It's important that you tell us the truth. But the truth felt like a weight too heavy to bear. Amelia's heart fluttered, her palms slick with sweat. She opened her mouth, but nothing came out. She could already see the scene playing out in her head. Michael's cold eyes, his warning. If you tell anyone, there will be consequences. The officers seemed to sense the hesitation, but they didn't push her. Instead, they nodded, their expressions polite but careful. Okay, but if you need help, Amelia, you can always reach out to us. There are people who can help you. The words, simple and kind, should have brought comfort, but they only made her feel more trapped. The officers, polite and professional as they were leaving, and her father would be right there, watching her every move. Amelia barely had time to process what had just happened before Michael's hand gripped her shoulder again, this time tighter, more possessive. That's enough, Michael said curtly to the officers, his voice dripping with false gratitude. Thank you for your time. I'll handle it from here. The officers hesitated, but eventually they turned and left. The door shut with a soft click, and the oppressive silence returned, thick and suffocating. Michael was still standing behind her, his hand still gripping her shoulder, but this time it felt like an iron clasp, pinning her in place. He leaned down close to her ear, his breath hot against her skin. You'd better not forget who's in charge here, Amelia. You're not going to get away with anything. Understand? Amelia didn't answer. She couldn't. She was too afraid to speak, too afraid to move. Her eyes burned with unshed tears, but she refused to let them fall. Michael's voice softened, almost mockingly. "Good girl." Later that night, as Amelia lay in bed, the weight of the day's events crushed down on her. She wanted to believe the officers, wanted to believe that someone could see the truth, that someone would care enough to help her. But after today, the doubt that had always lived in her chest deepened. Her father's lies were a tangled web, and she was trapped in it, alone. But then she remembered Miss Margaret. Miss Margaret, with her gentle smile and warm voice. Margaret, who had always asked if Amelia was okay, even when no one else seemed to notice. The thought of her gave Amelia a flicker of hope, a small, fragile spark, but one that might grow. Maybe, just maybe, there was someone who could help her unravel the lies. The days that followed the police visit felt like a slow burn. Time passed in an odd, distorted way, each hour stretching out in front of Amelia like a long, quiet hallway. The silence in the house seemed to grow thicker, heavier, as if the walls themselves were waiting for something to snap. And yet, despite the tension, everything returned to its usual rhythm. Michael's routines, Emily's distant silence, Amelia's quiet compliance. She tried not to think too much about the officers or the questions they'd asked. She couldn't afford to. The moment she did, the fear crept back in, colder than before. The same dread that had gripped her when she picked up the phone to call 911, when Michael had glared at her as if the entire world was watching, waiting for her to slip. But as the days wore on, something inside Amelia shifted. She couldn't ignore it anymore. She couldn't pretend she didn't need help. Her mind constantly returned to one thing: the small flicker of kindness she'd received from the officer, the brief moment of connection. They had seen her. For the briefest second, someone had noticed the fear in her eyes. That thought kept her moving, even though her body felt sluggish, weighed down by the constant fear of being caught. She couldn't let go of the idea of talking to Miss Margaret. Margaret was different from the others. She wasn't afraid of Michael. She didn't pretend like nothing was wrong. She saw Amelia, really saw her, in a way that Michael and even Emily never had. The day Emily took Amelia to school, the tension in the car was palpable. The air was thick with unspoken words. Amelia sat in the passenger seat, staring out the window, her face reflected in the glass, pale, drawn, but determined. The sky was overcast, clouds hanging heavy in the air, mirroring the dark weight in her chest. The car rumbled over the potholes in the road, the muffled hum of the tires against the pavement the only sound. Emily, as always, kept her eyes on the road, her hands firmly gripping the wheel, her silence an unspoken agreement between them. "Amelia," Emily said, breaking the silence, her voice quieter than usual. "You're doing better, right? At least, you're trying." Amelia's lips parted, but no words came out. The truth felt like a rock in her throat, too big to swallow. She didn't want to lie to Emily, but she couldn't bring herself to tell her what had really happened. She didn't know if Emily even wanted to know. Emily didn't press her. She never did. But the silence in the car between them was deafening, louder than any words. They were two strangers, bound together by a broken connection that neither could repair. As they approached the school, Amelia could feel the familiar knot of anxiety forming in her stomach. She didn't want to go inside, didn't want to see the other kids who were always so normal, so untouched by the things she carried inside her. But she had to go. She had to get through the day. The car pulled into the parking lot, and Amelia gathered her things, her hand trembling as she reached for the door handle. "Amelia." Emily's voice came again, this time tinged with something else. Guilt? Concern? Amelia couldn't tell. Amelia looked at her stepmother, her eyes filled with an unspoken question. "What?" "You know," Emily hesitated, if you ever need to talk, you can come to me. I know things haven't been easy, but we're in this together." Amelia studied her, not sure if she was hearing what she thought she was hearing. She wanted to believe Emily. She really did. But the words felt empty, like promises made out of obligation. She had seen Emily stay silent for so long, seen her turn away from the truth in front of her. How could she trust her now? "I'll be okay," Amelia finally muttered, her voice small. She opened the door before Emily could respond, stepping out into the cool morning air. The school building loomed in front of her, and for a moment she wished she could run. Run far away from the lies, from the house, from everything. But she didn't. The bell rang as Amelia walked through the school's front doors, the familiar sound of chatter and laughter filling the air. For a moment, it almost felt like she was entering another world, a world that wasn't weighed down by the constant fear at home. She tried to force herself to focus on the mundane, the ordinary. The sound of lockers slamming shut, the busy footsteps of her classmates, the bright fluorescent lights overhead. But she couldn't stop thinking about Margaret. It was during lunch when she saw her. Miss Margaret was standing near the school entrance, talking to a teacher, her eyes scanning the students as they walked by. When she saw Amelia, their gazes locked for a brief moment, long enough for Amelia to feel a pang of warmth, a flicker of something real. Margaret's eyes softened, and for the first time in days, Amelia felt like someone was really seeing her. She didn't know why. But in that moment, Amelia knew. Margaret was the one person who might be able to help. She had to talk to her. After lunch, when the bell rang for recess, Amelia made her way toward the garden behind the school, a quiet, almost forgotten area that few of the other students ever used. It was the perfect place to talk without being interrupted. Margaret often came here to take a break, a rare escape from the chaos of the school day. When Amelia reached the garden, she saw Margaret sitting on the worn bench, her gaze distant but warm. She looked up when Amelia approached, a knowing smile on her lips. "Hey, sweetie," Margaret greeted her softly, her voice gentle but laced with concern. "How are you?" Amelia hesitated, the words swirling in her mind, but not quite coming out. She wanted to tell Margaret everything, to unload all the pain and fear that had been building up inside her for so long. But how could she start? How could she make it real? Margaret noticed the hesitation, and her expression softened. "You don't have to say anything you're not ready to, but you know I'm here. Whenever you need me, Amelia. Whatever you need to say." Amelia swallowed, the lump in her throat threatening to choke her. She glanced at Margaret, searching for any sign of judgment, but there was none. Just kindness, genuine concern. Finally, after a long pause, Amelia whispered, "I don't know what to do. I don't know who to trust." Margaret's eyes softened even more, and she reached out, placing a gentle hand on Amelia's arm. "You're not alone, Amelia. Not anymore. You can trust me, okay?" Tears welled up in Amelia's eyes, but she held them back. For the first time in a long while, she felt like she wasn't just a frightened child waiting for something terrible to happen. She felt like someone cared. Margaret squeezed her arm reassuringly. "We'll figure this out together. You're so brave for even talking about it." Amelia looked away, the emotions too overwhelming to express in words. "I don't feel brave." "You are," Margaret said, her voice firm but kind. "I promise you, you are." For the first time in ages, Amelia felt a flicker of hope. It was small, fragile, but it was real. Maybe, just maybe, there was a way out of the darkness. The days following her conversation with Miss Margaret felt like a delicate balance between hope and terror. Amelia had never known anything but the heavy weight of silence and fear, so when Margaret's words, "You're not alone, you can trust me," echoed in her mind, it felt like a lifeline thrown into a stormy sea. She held onto it tightly, but fear still churned in her stomach. It was a strange feeling, hope. It was new to her, almost foreign. And yet, with every passing day, it grew a little stronger. The tiny seed Margaret had planted in her heart began to sprout, though the shadows in the corners of Amelia's mind still lingered. Could she really trust Margaret? Could she trust anyone? And what would happen to her once the truth came out? The thought of Michael's wrath was enough to make her stomach tighten, her hands tremble. But at least for now, there was someone who understood. The following Friday, when school let out, Amelia's heart raced. It wasn't the same rush of fear that she had grown used to. This time, it was anticipation. She had promised Margaret she would try to confide in her more, to tell her more of the truth. It wasn't going to be easy, but it was a first step. The hardest part would be starting. She left the school gates and walked briskly, not to the bus, but toward the small corner store Margaret worked at just a few blocks from her school. The store was humble. Faded signs, shelves stocked with essentials, the faint smell of fresh bread and cleaning products in the air. Miss Margaret had told her to come by whenever she could. And today, the weight of the decision felt lighter than it had before. As Amelia approached the shop, she saw Margaret standing behind the counter, her hair tucked into a neat ponytail, her smile warm despite the long hours. Margaret glanced up, her eyes softening when she saw Amelia standing in the doorway. "Hey, there she is," Margaret said, her voice easy and welcoming. "I was hoping you'd stop by. What can I get you today?" Amelia hesitated, her hands clenched nervously at her sides. Margaret seemed to sense the shift in her expression turning more serious. "Is everything okay, sweetheart?" she asked gently, leaning forward slightly. Amelia took a deep breath. This was it, the moment she had been both dreading and hoping for. She stepped inside, the door chimes tinkling softly above her head. I wanted to talk," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Margaret stood up, walking around the counter. "Of course, Amelia. Come here." She gently guided the girl toward the back of the shop, where there were a few chairs tucked away, out of sight from the front. The quiet was a comfort, and Amelia finally allowed herself to sit down. Margaret sat beside her, giving her a moment of space before speaking again. "Take your time," she said, her tone warm but patient. Amelia swallowed hard, her throat dry. She felt the familiar knot of fear tighten in her chest as the words she had kept hidden for so long started to form in her mind. "I don't know where to start," she whispered, her hands shaking as they fidgeted in her lap. Margaret nodded, her gaze never leaving Amelia's face. "You can start anywhere you like. Just remember, you're not alone." Amelia exhaled slowly, gathering her courage. It's about my dad. Michael. He's not what he seems. He hurts me." Margaret's face softened immediately, but she didn't interrupt. She let Amelia speak, giving her the space to let the words spill out, one by one. Amelia closed her eyes briefly, trying to steady herself before continuing. "He's always angry. At me. At everything. But it's worse when Emily's around. She never says anything. She doesn't help. She just lets him do it." Margaret's hand reached out, gently resting on Amelia's. Her touch was firm but kind, offering comfort without rushing the girl's confession. "Amelia, you're so brave for telling me this. I want you to know that what you're saying matters, and what your father is doing is not your fault." The words felt like a weight lifting from her chest, but the relief was only temporary. The truth had been spoken, but the fear of Michael's retribution still loomed like a dark cloud. I tried to tell someone before. The police. They came to the house the other night. But he convinced them it was just because I was upset about Mom dying." Amelia's voice trembled. "They didn't believe me." Margaret's brow furrowed, the sympathy in her eyes hardening into something else, something protective, like a silent promise. "He manipulated them. He's good at that, isn't he? He knows how to make people doubt you, to make it look like you're the problem." Amelia nodded, her lip trembling. "I don't know what to do anymore. I don't know who to trust. I'm scared to say anything, but I can't keep living like this." Margaret leaned in closer, her voice steady and filled with quiet strength. "You don't have to do it alone, Amelia. I'll help you. We'll figure out how to make sure you're safe. You're not trapped. We'll find a way out." Tears welled in Amelia's eyes as she stared at Margaret, unsure whether to feel relieved or terrified. For so long, she had carried the weight of her father's violence in secret, but now there was a small spark of something else, a possibility that had never seemed real before. What if he finds out? What if he? Amelia's voice broke, her chest tight with panic. She couldn't let herself imagine what Michael would do if he found out she had confided in someone. Margaret squeezed her hand reassuringly. "I'll be there, and we'll take it step by step. We'll talk to the right people. We won't let him keep controlling you." Amelia nodded, her eyes stinging with tears she had held back for so long. "But what if he hurts me worse?" The question hung in the air, heavy and fragile, and Margaret didn't look away. Her expression remained calm, but her gaze was unwavering. "I know you're scared, Amelia, but you're already stronger than you think, and there are people who can help us. People who won't let him get away with it." Amelia's breath hitched, and for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to cry. Not from fear, but from the release of holding everything in for so long. The tears fell freely, but Margaret's hand remained in hers, a constant, comforting presence. Later that evening, as Amelia walked home, her heart was still heavy, but something had shifted. For the first time, she didn't feel quite so alone. Margaret's words had planted a seed of possibility, a glimmer of hope in her heart. The streets were quieter now, the sun dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows across the pavement. As she walked past the familiar houses, she glanced at the one she called home. Michael's presence loomed like a shadow behind the windows, but Amelia felt a small flicker of defiance rise within her. The darkness he had cast over her life was not the end of her story. It wasn't over. She still had a long way to go, but with Margaret's support and the quiet strength she had found within herself, Amelia was beginning to believe that things could be different. Maybe, just maybe, she could find a way out. And that glimmer of hope, fragile as it was, became the thing she held onto most tightly as she walked through the door. The house was always quieter after Michael left for work. The tension in the air seemed to lift, like the world exhaled in relief. Emily, ever the silent partner in the household's dysfunction, moved through the space like a shadow. No words, no eye contact. Just silence. Amelia had learned to navigate this silence, to avoid the worst of it by staying small, staying invisible. But in the stillness of the house, a new thought began to grow. The sudden, desperate impulse to uncover more. What had her mother been like before everything had gone wrong? What had happened to her? For weeks, Amelia had avoided the small corner of her room where her mother's belongings had been shoved into a box. Old clothes, papers, photos. It felt wrong, like trespassing into a forgotten world. But now, something pulled her toward it, something deep inside her that needed to know the truth. She stood in the doorway of her room, her gaze drawn to the floorboard beneath the bed, the one she had never dared to disturb. It was a loose board. She had noticed it years ago, but had never thought much of it. Until now. What if there was something there? Amelia swallowed hard, her heart racing with a mix of excitement and fear. She crouched down beside the bed, her fingers trembling as they pried at the edges of the board. It creaked as she pulled it up, and there, hidden beneath the floor, wrapped in a piece of faded cloth, was a small leather-bound book, her mother's diary. Amelia's breath caught in her throat. She recognized the old, familiar leather cover, the same one Maria had used to jot down thoughts and feelings during happier times. The weight of the book in her hands felt heavier than it should have, like it carried the weight of secrets that had never been meant for her to uncover. She sat back on her heels, staring at the diary for a moment. Her hand shook as she carefully opened the first page, the paper old but the ink still legible. February 17th, 2012. Amelia is growing so fast. I can't believe she's already 5. She talks more now, and her laugh is the sweetest sound I've ever heard. I only wish Michael could see her the way I do, as someone precious, someone worth protecting. But I fear fear that he will always see her as a burden, as something to control. Amelia's heart skipped a beat. Her mother had known. She had known something was wrong, had seen the same thing Amelia saw. The weight of those words crushed her, but at the same time, it was a small, comforting thing to know that Maria had seen her. She had been aware. She had wanted to protect her. Amelia quickly turned the page, hoping for more answers, more signs that Maria had fought to protect her, fought to escape. March 3rd, 2012. I don't know how much longer I can do this. Michael's anger is growing. I'm not sure if it's the pressure of work or something deeper. Sometimes I think he's just waiting for me to break. I've tried to leave twice, but both times, something pulls me back. Guilt, fear, responsibility. I can't leave him. Not yet. Not without Amelia. Amelia's breath came faster now, and she could feel the tears beginning to burn behind her eyes. Her mother had tried. She had tried to escape, but something had always stopped her. Fear, guilt, responsibility. Amelia had been too young to understand what her mother was going through, but now the pieces began to fit together. Maria had never been weak. She had simply been trapped, just like Amelia. She kept reading, each entry pulling her deeper into the world her mother had lived in. The diary revealed a portrait of a woman who had loved fiercely and fought silently, always thinking of her daughter. Maria's words echoed with desperation, with a quiet strength that Amelia had never fully appreciated before. The next entry was dated only a week before Maria's death. June 12, 2013. I've made a plan. I'm going to take Amelia and leave. I found a place for us to go, a place far from Michael. I can't do this anymore. I'm scared, but I have to be brave. For her. I will do whatever it takes to protect my daughter. I've saved enough money. I can do it. We can leave tonight. Amelia froze, her pulse thudding in her ears. Her mother had planned to leave. She had been ready to escape. The words burned into her mind like a brand. She had been ready. She had been ready to leave him. But Maria hadn't gotten the chance. Something had happened before she could make good on her plan. And now, Amelia was left with the aftermath, the echoes of her mother's courage and fear. She carefully closed the diary, feeling its weight in her hands. She had learned something important, something that had shaken her, but also lit a spark of defiance within her. Maria hadn't given up. She hadn't stayed because she didn't want to fight. She had stayed because she had been too afraid of what might happen if she left. She had loved Amelia too much to risk it. But Amelia wasn't her mother. She wasn't trapped in the same cycle. The pieces were coming together now. The picture of a woman's life that had been silenced far too soon. The picture of a girl who had to make the choice her mother couldn't. And the choice was clear. Amelia wasn't going to wait for someone to save her. She wasn't going to let Michael win. Not anymore. The next day, after school, Amelia couldn't wait to see Miss Margaret. She carried the diary with her, holding it tight to her chest, like a precious secret. When she arrived at the shop, she found Margaret in the back, stocking shelves. Her face brightened when she saw Amelia, but her expression quickly turned to concern when she noticed the diary. "Amelia, is everything okay?" Margaret asked, setting down the box of supplies. Amelia nodded, her voice quiet but steady. "I found something from my mom." She held out the diary, her hands trembling slightly. "It's her diary. She tried to leave him, Margaret. She was planning to leave, but something happened before she could." Margaret took the diary gently, her eyes scanning the pages quickly. "I'm so sorry, Amelia. I didn't know." Amelia swallowed hard, trying to control the wave of emotion rising in her chest. "She loved me so much. She didn't want me to grow up like this. I think I need to do what she couldn't." Margaret closed the diary softly, looking at Amelia with a mixture of admiration and determination. "You're stronger than you know, Amelia, and you're not alone anymore. Whatever happens, we'll do this together. We'll make sure Michael doesn't control your life anymore." Amelia nodded, her resolve hardening. "I'm ready. I'm ready to fight. For her. And for me. The tears that had threatened to fall finally came. But this time, they felt different. They weren't tears of fear, but of something else. Grief, yes, but also strength. Her mother's story, her mother's sacrifice, was no longer something buried in the past. It was a call to action. And Amelia was finally ready to answer it. Amelia stood in front of the mirror, staring at her reflection as if seeing herself for the first time. The girl looking back at her was still the same, small, fragile, with wide eyes that held too many secrets for someone so young. But there was something else in those eyes now. A flicker of defiance, something that hadn't been there before. It was a fire that burned quietly but steadily beneath the surface, something that Maria's diary had ignited. She wasn't the same girl who had whispered her fears into the shadows, who had buried her voice beneath the weight of Michael's control. She wasn't the same girl who had hidden her pain behind closed doors, hoping the silence would protect her. The silence was no longer enough. It had been 3 days since she had read the last entry in her mother's diary, the one where Maria had planned to leave, to take Amelia and run. Amelia had made her decision then. She would break the silence, even if it shattered her entire world. The thought of confronting Michael filled her with a cold, heavy dread, but the thought of staying silent any longer was worse. She couldn't keep pretending anymore. She couldn't keep pretending that everything was okay, that Michael's rage, his cruelty, his silence, his manipulation, hadn't left a mark on her. She was stronger than that. She had to be. The decision was made. And now all she had to do was act. It was late afternoon when Emily told Amelia she was going to run errands and would be back in a few hours. The house felt quieter than usual, like the space itself was holding its breath. Michael had left for work early that morning, as he always did, but Amelia couldn't shake the feeling that something was different today. She picked up her backpack from the floor, feeling the weight of her mother's diary hidden beneath the lining. With a quick glance at the door, she slipped out of the house. The cool air outside felt sharp against her skin, the wind pulling at her hair. As Amelia walked down the sidewalk, her pace quickening with every step, her mind raced. She had promised Margaret that she would take action, that she would talk to someone who could help. But who? Who could she trust? She thought about Margaret, her steadfast ally. But more importantly, she thought of Detective Ryan, the officer who had taken her initial 911 call seriously. Amelia had been unsure at first, doubting anyone would truly believe her. But Detective Ryan had listened, and more importantly, he had believed. That belief had been a rare thing in her life, a beacon in the darkness. She reached Margaret's shop, the bell chiming softly as she entered. Margaret was behind the counter, as usual, but when she saw Amelia's pale face, she immediately stood up. "Amelia? What's wrong?" Margaret asked, her voice low with concern. Amelia's heart beat faster as she approached. She could feel the weight of the diary pressing against her back. It felt like the final link in a chain she couldn't undo. Amelia stopped, swallowing hard. Her hands were trembling, but she forced herself to continue. "I need to talk to Detective Ryan. I can't keep this inside anymore. It's not enough just to tell you. I need to do something." Margaret studied her for a long moment, her eyes soft but sharp with understanding. "You're sure about this, Amelia? This is the hardest part, the first step. But once you take it, there's no going back." "I know," Amelia whispered, "but I can't wait anymore. I need to make him stop." Margaret nodded, her eyes shining with quiet admiration. "You're so brave. I'll make the call for you. I'll go with you if you want." Amelia shook her head. "I have to do this myself. I need to prove that I'm not just his little girl anymore. I'm not just a scared kid hiding in the dark." Margaret gave a small smile, her voice full of quiet pride. "You're not a scared kid, Amelia. You're a survivor. And you're not alone." The police station was cold, sterile, and full of tension. It smelled of paper, fresh ink, and coffee, a far cry from the chaotic and dark atmosphere of home. Amelia's heart hammered in her chest as they walked through the automatic doors, Margaret by her side. She could feel every eye on her, but she kept her head down, focusing on the task ahead. They approached the front desk, and a uniformed officer looked up, recognizing Margaret immediately. "Miss Lewis, good to see you. How can we help today?" Margaret took a steadying breath. "This is Amelia. She wants to talk to Detective Ryan about some important matters regarding her father." The officer's face shifted slightly, his eyes softening when he saw the girl's small, tense frame. "Of course. Let me get him." Amelia stood silently by the desk, her hands gripping the straps of her backpack so hard that her knuckles whitened. Her body felt like it was moving in slow motion, but her mind was racing. She had made it this far. The rest of it was up to her. A few moments later, Detective Ryan walked over, his dark suit a sharp contrast to the casual atmosphere of the station. He was tall, with a firm but friendly demeanor that had put Amelia at ease during their earlier conversations. When his eyes fell on her, his expression softened immediately. "Amelia," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "What's going on?" She could barely meet his eyes. The words caught in her throat, but she knew she couldn't turn back now. She had to speak. "My dad, Michael," Amelia whispered, her voice barely audible. She cleared her throat, forcing herself to speak louder. "He hurts me. He's hurt me for a long time. And I think he hurt my mom too. She was planning to leak him, Detective." She wrote it in her diary. She pulled the small leather-bound book from her bag, her fingers brushing over the worn edges of the cover. She handed it to Detective Ryan, who took it carefully, his eyes scanning the first few pages. "This is important, Amelia," he said quietly. "You've done the right thing, but I need you to tell me everything you remember. You're safe here." Amelia's voice shook as she began recounting the things she had hidden for so long. Michael's temper, the isolation, the manipulations. She spoke about her mother's fear, her mother's quiet strength, and the failed attempts to escape. Each word felt like a weight being lifted off her shoulders. She was no longer trapped in the silence. Detective Ryan listened carefully, nodding as he took notes. "You've been incredibly brave, Amelia. This is exactly what we need. The next step is getting a full statement from you, and I'll make sure we take it from there. You're not alone anymore." As Amelia spoke, the door to the station opened behind them, and Michael stepped in, his face pale with surprise. He spotted Amelia immediately, and his eyes narrowed, his posture stiffening. "What the hell is this?" Michael demanded, his voice cold and commanding. "What is she doing here?" Detective Ryan's face remained neutral as he turned to Michael. "You're not welcome here, Michael. I suggest you leave." Michael's eyes flicked to Amelia, his gaze filled with venom. "You think you're safe now. You think anyone is going to believe you. You don't know what you're doing." Amelia stood her ground, meeting his eyes with a quiet strength she hadn't known she possessed. "You can't control me anymore, Michael. I'm telling the truth." Detective Ryan stepped between them, his voice calm but firm. "I suggest you leave now, Mr. Davis, before this becomes a matter for the courts." Michael sneered but backed away, his words dripping with malice. "This isn't over. Amelia, you'll regret this." As Michael stormed out of the station, Amelia's breath came in shaky bursts. She felt like she might collapse, but something in her had changed. She had stood up to him. She had broken the silence. "You did it," Margaret said, her voice full of pride. "You're going to be okay, Amelia." Amelia looked up at Detective Ryan, who smiled at her with quiet approval. "You're incredibly brave, Amelia. And now we have the evidence we need. We'll make sure he doesn't hurt anyone else again." Amelia felt the weight of the moment, but it was different now. The silence had been broken, and for the first time, she felt like she had a voice that was her own. The days following her visit to the police station were a blur of emotions. Every moment seemed to stretch longer than it should. And yet, The fear, the anger, the overwhelming sense of dread never seemed to leave her. Amelia had done what she thought she had to do. What she had told herself was the right thing. She had broken the silence, given the police the evidence they needed, and even stood up to Michael for the first time in years. But the feeling of relief, of empowerment, was short-lived. The fear crept back into her every time she stepped into her home, every time she heard the car pull into the driveway, every time she heard Michael's footsteps in the hallway. The walls of the house felt smaller, closing in on her, and the silence that followed Michael's return from work was suffocating. It was late in the evening when Amelia found herself in her room, staring out the window at the darkening sky. She had wanted to call Margaret, wanted to hear her comforting voice, but something in her held back. There was a gnawing feeling in her chest, a whisper that told her something worse was coming. The truth was, Michael wasn't someone who took defeat lightly. Amelia had seen that before, had watched him twist and bend the truth to suit his own needs. The calm facade he put on in front of the police wasn't the real him. She knew that. He was a master of manipulation, and he would stop at nothing to reclaim control, to bury the truth. She heard the front door slam open downstairs. A familiar chill ran through her veins. Her pulse quickened as she stood up, listening to the sound of Michael's voice, low and harsh, echoing through the house. "Where is she?" he growled. Amelia felt her breath catch in her throat. He was looking for her. She took a quick step back, instinctively hiding the diary she had kept close ever since that fateful day, tucking it into the drawer of her nightstand. She had been trying to make sense of it, trying to process what it meant for her, but now she couldn't think straight. Michael was coming for her. There was a sudden knock on her bedroom door. Her heart skipped a beat. She knew it was him. "Amelia." Michael's voice was sharp, like the edge of a knife. "Open the door." Amelia didn't move. She stood there, trembling, listening to the sound of his footsteps drawing closer. A surge of dread washed over her, but with it came something else, something stronger than fear. Defiance. "No," she said, her voice small, but steady. The door rattled in its frame as Michael slammed his fist against it. "Open it. Now," he roared. She could hear his frustration, his rage growing. His voice shook with a dangerous kind of anger, an anger that Amelia knew all too well. It was the kind of anger that threatened to explode at any moment, the kind that could break things, and worse, people. "Don't make me come in there, Amelia," he warned, his voice low, dripping with threat. Amelia's mind raced. She could call Margaret, call the police, do something, but the panic was paralyzing. Would it even make a difference? Would anyone come in time? The sound of the doorknob turning made her stomach flip. She could almost feel his presence on the other side, the pressure of his anger pressing against the thin walls of her room. He was pushing, testing her resolve. "Please, Michael," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The words a quiet plea. There was a pause on the other side of the door, and Amelia's heart pounded in her chest. She could hear him breathing heavily, his words laced with disgust. "You don't get it, do you? You think you can just tell lies, tell your little stories, and everything will change. You'll always be my little girl, no matter what you say. You can't escape me, Amelia. You can't." Before he could finish, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway. Amelia's breath caught again. She wasn't alone. "Michael." Emily's voice rang out from downstairs, sharp and commanding. "Enough." Amelia could hear Michael's angry muttering from behind the door, but Emily's voice cut through the tension like a knife. "You need to calm down," Emily continued, her tone softer but firm. "This isn't helping anything." Amelia remained still, listening closely. Her stepmother's words felt like a thin thread of safety in the storm of Michael's rage. But Amelia also knew the truth. Emily's voice, though louder than usual, was still small in the face of Michael's overwhelming force. Amelia's heart twisted at the thought. Why didn't Emily stand up for her more? Why was she always so afraid? "You've been hiding things from me, haven't you?" Michael hissed, his words dripping with venom. You think you can play me like this? I'll make you regret it. Amelia squeezed her eyes shut, fighting the tears that threatened to come. She couldn't give in. Not now. Not ever again. A moment later, Emily's voice softened. Michael, please. We need to think. We need to. I don't need to think. Michael interrupted, his voice low, filled with fury. I just need her to learn her place. The words hit Amelia like a punch in the stomach. She felt small again, trapped, but something inside her snapped. No, Amelia said, louder now, her voice shaky but resolute. I'm not your little girl anymore. There was a long pause. Then Michael's voice, cold and dangerous, spoke again. You think you can defy me? You're nothing without me. Nothing. You'll see. You'll all see. The silence that followed was suffocating. Amelia's heart thudded in her chest, but she could feel something changing within her. A sense of power, however small, was rising within her. She wasn't nothing. She was someone. Someone who deserved to be heard, to be protected. Emily's footsteps approached. Amelia. It's okay, she said, though her voice trembled. We need to talk about this. Come downstairs. Amelia hesitated, but then she opened the door. Her eyes met her stepmother's, and for the first time, she saw something flicker in Emily's expression, something that wasn't just fear, but guilt. Come with me, Emily urged, her voice softer now. I'll help you. Amelia swallowed hard, unsure. You've always stayed silent, Emily. You never helped before. Why now? Emily's eyes filled with regret, but she didn't look away. I was scared. I still am. But I can't keep letting this happen. I'll stand by you. I will. We'll get through this together. Amelia nodded slowly, feeling the weight of the moment settle in her chest. She wasn't sure if Emily's promises meant anything anymore, but one thing was certain. She couldn't do this alone. As they descended the stairs, the weight of what was about to happen settled over Amelia like a heavy cloak. The breaking point had come. Michael would never be the same after today, but neither would she. She wasn't that scared little girl anymore. And for the first time in a long time, Amelia felt a spark of hope. The fight wasn't over. Not by a long shot, but she was ready. She was ready to fight for her freedom, ready to break the chains that had bound her for so long. Downstairs, Michael paced back and forth in the living room, his face flushed with anger. The tension in the room was thick, thicker than it had ever been before. Amelia stood tall, feeling the weight of her decision settle into her bones. Emily stood beside her, looking more uncertain than Amelia had ever seen her. Michael glared at both of them, his eyes dark with fury. You think this will make a difference? You think you can just walk away from me? Amelia met his gaze without flinching. Yes, I do. For a moment, time seemed to stop. Then Michael took a step forward, his voice barely more than a growl. You're making a big mistake. But Amelia was done being afraid. The only mistake I've made was not speaking up sooner. As her words echoed in the room, the reality of what was happening settled in. Michael's power was slipping, and Amelia was ready to take it back. She was finally free. The sky had turned a soft lavender, the evening sun dipping low beneath the horizon, casting long shadows across the empty street. Amelia sat on the porch of the small, modest house, her legs tucked up beneath her, her bare feet resting lightly on the weathered wood. The air felt cool against her skin, a reminder that autumn was creeping in, bringing with it the promise of change. Change. It was a word she'd come to understand more deeply over the past few months. Her life had been a series of unspoken rules, of darkness and fear, of silence and secrets. But now there was light. She was free. The weight of everything that had happened since she first stepped into the police station with Maria's diary still sat heavy in her chest, but there was a new clarity to it. Every step she had taken, every word she had spoken, had been a part of her journey toward reclaiming who she was. And though the scars would never fully fade, she had learned to live with them, to let them remind her of her strength, not her weakness. The house was quiet now. The heavy presence of Michael was gone, replaced by the warmth of a home that had once been a place of fear, but was slowly becoming something new. Emily was inside, cooking dinner, her first real attempt at doing so without the weight of fear hovering over her. Margaret, her constant ally, had visited earlier in the day, bringing a basket of freshly baked cookies and a warm smile. Detective Ryan had stayed in touch, ensuring everything was in place for the eventual court hearings. But most importantly, Amelia had finally started school again. The teachers and students didn't know the full extent of her story, only what they had been told, but that didn't matter anymore. She was just another kid now, doing her best to build the life she deserved. "Amelia?" A voice called gently from inside the house. It was Emily, her voice a little softer than usual. "Dinner's ready." Amelia smiled to herself, feeling the small, but steady, warmth of what now passed for home. Emily had been different since the night everything had come crashing down. The guilt in her eyes was still there, still present in the moments when she thought Amelia wasn't looking, but there was something else now. A slow, tentative bond between them that Amelia couldn't fully explain but welcomed all the same. As she stood and made her way to the door, she glanced back at the street, the quiet town around her, and the sky stretching above. It was strange to think that her life had been so tightly confined to the walls of one house, one man's control, for so long. And now, as she stepped into the world, she felt the weight of possibility, something she had never dared to imagine before. Inside, Emily had set the table, and the smell of spaghetti filled the air. It wasn't gourmet, but it was theirs. Amelia's stomach growled at the scent. Emily, noticing, gave a soft laugh. "I'm trying to make up for all the nights I let you go to bed hungry, okay?" Amelia didn't know what to say. She still felt a tremor of uncertainty every time Emily reached out to her, but the gesture was enough to ease some of the tension between them. It's fine," Amelia replied quietly, but with a softness in her voice that felt new. "I'm not hungry." Emily frowned, setting down the spoon in her hand. She walked over, hesitating just for a moment before sitting across from Amelia at the table. "I know I wasn't there when you needed me most. I don't think I'll ever be able to make up for that. But I want you to know that I'm trying. I want to be a better person. For you." Amelia's heart twisted with something that felt like forgiveness, though it was still too early to say for sure. Her life had been defined by silence, by people who pretended things weren't happening, by people who couldn't or wouldn't fight back against the evil that lurked in their own homes. But Emily had changed. The quiet woman who once stood by Michael's side, too afraid to speak, was now someone who had stepped into the light, even if that meant facing her own mistakes. "I know," Amelia said, her voice steady, but softer than it had been when they first met in the aftermath of the arrest. "I know you're trying. I see that." Emily looked at her with a mixture of hope and regret, then nodded. "And I'll keep trying, Amelia. Every day. For you." Amelia smiled faintly, her fingers trailing along the edge of her napkin. She was still learning how to accept this new version of herself, this version that didn't have to hide anymore. The girl who had once been afraid to speak had now found a voice, and every day she used it more. She was slowly learning that she wasn't just surviving anymore, she was living. The doorbell rang, and Amelia's heart skipped. She stood up, a bit too quickly, and ran to the door. She flung it open to see Margaret standing there, smiling warmly, as usual with a basket of fresh flowers in her arms. "I thought I'd bring something for the table," Margaret said with a wink, holding up the basket like a peace offering. "But it looks like you're already well fed." Amelia's heart felt lighter than it had in days. "Come in, Margaret," she said, her voice bright. "We're just about to eat." Margaret stepped inside with a soft chuckle. "I'll just stay for a few minutes," she said, glancing at Emily. "If you're sure you're not too busy. I'm not trying to steal your dinner or anything. Emily laughed, the sound genuine, a little freer than it had been in years. "You're always welcome here, Margaret." As Margaret placed the flowers in a vase on the kitchen table, Amelia felt the tightness in her chest ease. There was something new in the air, something that hadn't been there before, but that she now knew to be a kind of peace. The weight of everything Michael had done, of the years of terror, of the constant sense of being trapped, was starting to lift. It wasn't gone, not yet, but Amelia had come a long way from the terrified girl who had whispered into the phone that first night, too afraid to speak above a whisper. "You know," Margaret said, her tone light but carrying a depth of meaning, "I think your mom would be so proud of you, Amelia. She would have wanted you to know that. To know that you're stronger than you ever imagined." Amelia nodded, a small but genuine smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "I think so, too. I think she would have wanted me to be happy." And for the first time in her life, Amelia allowed herself to believe it, to imagine a future where she could be happy. She looked around the room at the people who had stood by her, the ones who had helped her find the courage to speak, to act. They were her family now. The path ahead was uncertain, but she was no longer afraid of it. The light in the room seemed to glow a little brighter, a little warmer. It was only the beginning, but it was a beginning worth holding on to. "Dinner's ready," Emily called from the kitchen. Amelia's heart felt full. She had a place now, and that place was here, with people who loved her, with a future that was finally her own. As she walked into the kitchen to sit down with Margaret and Emily, Amelia looked up at the fading light outside, the sky turning from lavender to dark, and felt something stirring deep inside. It was hope, pure and undiluted. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't just surviving. She was finally living, and she would never go back.